You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 7th of November 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Election night dust has settled here in Washington, D.C. as the United States puts in motion the process of a smooth transfer of power. But what will Donald Trump's new administration look like, and what's next for the Democrats? The Monocle Daily, live from Washington, D.C., starts now.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Monocle Daily, coming to you live from Washington, D.C. I'm Carlota, Rebelo.
And I'm Chris Cermak. President Joe Biden has stressed today that there will be a peaceful transfer of power when Donald Trump is sworn in on the 20th of January. It comes in stark contrast to Trump's refusal to accept the results 4 years ago. But will it be effective in bringing the country back together?
We also take a look at foreign policy, ask what Donald Trump's situation room for the second term might look like, and which conflict he'll turn his focus to first.
Plus, with the United States being Japan's most important economic and security partner, what will Tokyo's approach be to the new president?
Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily, live from Washington. So welcome to the Monocle Daily. We're live in Washington, D.C. for the last episode of our special series on the U.S. elections. The peaceful transfer of power is well underway here in the United States, from one president to a dramatically different one.
Both Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have called President-elect Donald Trump, who will take office in January. And earlier today, in a speech, Joe Biden himself spoke passionately about the importance of accepting the new administration.
For over 200 years, America has carried on the greatest experiment in self-government in the history of the world. And that's not hyperbole, that's a fact. We're the people. The people vote and choose their own leaders, and they do it peacefully. And we're in a democracy. The will of the people always prevails. Yesterday, I spoke with President-elect Trump to congratulate him on his victory. And I assured him that I'd direct my entire administration to work with his team to ensure a peaceful and orderly transition.
Joining us here in the studio is Brent Griffiths, who's a senior politics reporter for Business Insider. Brent, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Let's tell us, first of all, what you made of Joe Biden's speech, because I think it's interesting. He will have been hurting as this result. This was an election that he expected himself to win, of course, before having to bow out. He believes that Donald Trump is a threat. He has said that, obviously, many times on the campaign trail. But he also believes in the peaceful transfer of power. Maybe he believes in that even more.
I think that's absolutely right. I think at his core, he is a politician and really an institutionalist. He spent decades in the United States Senate, and I think he has a relationship to government that's fundamentally different than former President Trump. And so I think the fact that you saw him underline the necessity to have a peaceful transfer of power, underline how he tries to want to bridge that, as you said, the unity for this country really fits with what we know about Joe Biden at his core.
Now, I know it's still early days, but last time around, Donald Trump famously skipped Biden's inauguration. We are hoping, of course, that that won't be the case now. But do you think that this idea of building bridges between the two, the relationship has always been fraught? Do you think that this is a reset, or we're well past that?
I don't know if I would say it's a reset. I think both Trump and Biden probably see some upside to kind of letting this play out. You saw yesterday that President Biden and President Trump's team confirmed that President Biden invited Donald Trump to the White House, which is a traditional thing that obviously did not happen in 2020 when President Trump did not extend that similar courtesy to President Biden. But I really think that both of them kind of recognize that this election is over, and also just the sheer weight of this election, in particular, just how convincingly Republicans won, I feel like also makes it kind of easier to try to let bygones be bygones.
Well, and speaking of that, though, Kamala Harris, of course, herself also gave a very magnanimous concession speech, one should say, even though she, too, will have been, deeply hurting from this result. This was a pretty strong rejection of what she stands for, what Democrats stand for, basically. What do you make of where they are right now? How are they going to reset?
I think they're in the wilderness right now, right? And I think you see parties who have been in the similar spot that they're in right now. That's how they've kind of grasped forward in the past. They were someone here in 2016, but I think in talking to Democrats, you hear that this loss hurts more because at least then they had the popular vote. At least then they could say that there were areas of the country where they felt like their message was still resonating.
They could also argue that that was sort of a fluke, which is very hard to do.
Right, exactly. This is a full-scale acceptance and really a fulsome endorsement of Donald Trump and everything he stood for and his record in office.
Let's hear a little of what Joe Biden had to say earlier today.
I also hope we can lay to rest the question about the integrity of the American electoral system. It is honest, it is fair, and it is transparent, and it can be trusted, win or lose. I also hope we can restore the respect for all our election workers who busted their necks and took risks at the outset. We should thank them for staffing voting sites, counting the votes, protecting the very integrity of the election. Many of them are volunteers who do it simply out of love for their country. And as they did their duty as citizens, I will do my duty as president. I'll fulfill my oath. I will honor the Constitution. On January 20th, we'll have a peaceful transfer of power here in America.
Now, one of the issues throughout this campaign has been the worry surrounding these elections. But here we are, on Thursday, and pretty much everything went off without a hitch. Were you surprised?
Not necessarily. I think this is somewhat what you expect, right? You see in most normal elections that, yes, there are some precincts where maybe the machines go down or the line is too long, but really, states and local governments have so much experience running these elections that they're able to kind of just do it without really thinking about it in a way. And the other reality is I think a lot of them learned a lot from the experience in 2020.
Now, one other thing, we were talking about the transition. I think one thing that's been interesting for me, just even getting the emails already from the Trump campaign now that they move into transition mode, but also being at the rallies. I mean, this seems so much more professional than it was in 2016, when I think maybe even, Trump and his people were surprised by their victory. So coming into office was a challenge. It was something they weren't necessarily expecting to have to do. This time it is extremely professional. Do we expect the administration itself to be more professional as well?
I think that is the absolute question that I don't know if anyone can really answer. And I think the reality is, we've heard for so long that Donald Trump has a different tone or a different approach, and it never quite pans out. So unfortunately, we'll have to wait and see.
Maybe his staff, not so much him. Is that one way to look at it?
I think so. I think the reality is that at least they hope that there will probably be less drama this time, not necessarily because from a more professional approach, but at the very least because the people around the president will be committed to his agenda.
Brent Griffiths from the Business Insider, thank you very much for joining us on the Monocle Daily.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to this special edition of the Monocle Daily from Washington, D.C. The United States is Japan's most important economic and security partner, with Tokyo being a key ally for Washington in the region. So what will the relationship under a Trump second term look like? Well, I'm delighted to say we are joined here in our studio by Ken Moriyasu, who is the Washington diplomatic correspondent for Nikkei Asia. Ken, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start with, perhaps before your reactions to what happened the last few days, it is interesting that we were just talking about the fact that you were here 20 years ago as well for another election, which was Bush versus Kerry, the younger Bush versus John Kerry. And there are actually quite a few surprising similarities between the two elections, aren't there?
Yeah, I think the candidates, the Democratic candidates, are very similar in John Kerry and Kamala Harris, in that they tried to cater to everybody. They didn't want to take a strong position. In the case of John Kerry, it wasn't clear his position on the Iraq War. And then in terms of Kamala Harris, it wasn't really clear on her position on Gaza and Israel. And if you look at Kamala Harris's speech at the Democratic Convention in Chicago, she spent almost the exact number of words for speaking about Israel and for Palestine, exactly the same amount of seconds. I think it was 37 seconds to 38 seconds, trying to take a balance between Israel and Palestine.
That need to play like the diplomat, as it were.
Yeah, and it didn't work. In Dearborn, Michigan, when there is a large Arab American vote, I think if you add the votes that Trump got and Joe Stein got, it was 61%. So people were saying, oh, no, they're not going to vote for Trump because it'll be worse for the Palestinian people. But no, they didn't vote for Harris. They actually voted for Trump or Joe Stein. They didn't stay home. So they made a statement. So that was interesting. And I feel that both in terms of Kerry and Harris, it wasn't clear what they were standing for. And also they tended to flip-flop. It comes down to not the policy itself that the people are looking for. It's whether you can trust the candidate, whether they stick to their convictions. And in the case of Kerry and Harris, they looked like they were just saying what their advisors told them to say rather than coming from the bottom of the heart. Whereas in Trump's case, he's talking what he believes.
Oh, yes.
Let's take a step back to election night. Now, it is curious where we are broadcasting from here in Washington, D.C. is just next door to your offices. What was election night like for you? And I guess I'm curious to hear, what have been the most interesting aspects of the night and of the result for your readers back in Japan?
Well, so I have a friend in Canada, and we were texting as the votes were being counted, and he was saying, it's like watching the Super Bowl. And I told him later on in the evening, well, if it is like the Super Bowl, the result was decided in the first quarter. And it became a super boring match because it was so one-sided.
I think there was actually a watch party we were at that also labeled their party as the Super Bowl. So yes, there's a lot of similarities.
It wasn't a close game at all. So, yeah. What it means for Asia, I think the clear win of Trump is different from the 2016 win in that could have been labeled as being like an anti-Hillary vote or like a vote of protest to the Obama years or like a fluke. But this time it was not a fluke. People chose Donald Trump despite all his problems. We have a tendency to say, oh, Trump is like unpredictable and he's going to do what he wants, what he feels like at that any given morning. But no, I think Asia has to realize that he has a mandate. It's a reflection of what the American people wanted. So it's not just Trump. Whatever Trump does, it's not just Donald Trump himself. So I think there's a different attitude. There needs to be a different attitude handling this American administration.
Now, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was quite skillful in the way he handled Donald Trump. And I was reading earlier this morning that Shigeru Ishiba, the current Prime Minister, has already said he's hoping to meet Donald Trump later this month right here in the United States. Is this him trying to kind of emulate what Abe had been doing? And are we going to be able to see, how do you predict this future relationship to look like under the new Prime Minister?
Yeah, so if you read Shinzo Abe's memoir, it talks about his many phone calls with Donald Trump, and they would last 80 minutes to 90 minutes. You'd think that the American president is very busy. No, Trump would spend 90 minutes talking with Abe. And the first 15 minutes would be about diplomatic issues that they have to talk about. The rest would be talking about golf or gossiping about Angela Merkel of Germany. It was very like an ordinary person talks. And Trump, I think, didn't have many foreign leaders that he knew to begin with. And Abe, he liked for some reason. Maybe it was because Abe was the first leader to visit him right after the election, but they established a good chemistry. This is interesting because Abe writes that he felt much more comfortable with Trump than Obama. So that's interesting too, because one of the reasons is Abe took Obama to Jiro, the Michelin 3-star restaurant in Tokyo, the most coveted restaurant, and Obama didn't finish his sushi. This is so Obama. But anyway, for that reason, Abe didn't like Obama. He liked Trump, and Trump liked Abe more than Abe liked Trump. So they had a good relationship, and that really did help U.S.-Japan relations back then. Now, the world is different, America is different, Trump is different. Trump is different for the reasons I just mentioned. The world is different because so much has happened. Ukraine and Russia are at war. Israel and Iran are shooting directly at each other. And there's this new partnership between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So these are all things that weren't present under Trump's first term. So they would have to deal with these. And Japan cannot and should not fall back on this, depending too much on the leader's personal relationship. Japan has to, and Ishiba has to make the case that Japan's geographical location, being right at the proximity of Taiwan, is irreplaceable by any other country. The fact that it has so many U.S. bases and there's 54,000 American troops, the largest contingent anywhere in the world. So these are things to build on, and it has to be an interest-based relationship, not a values-based relationship. We're not united because we are free and democratic and all that. We are united because we have the similar interests. And if that's the case, I think, because I also think Trump will be looking to leave his legacy as well. I don't think he wants to be remembered as the crazy guy who gave up Taiwan because he wanted soybean purchases or anything like that. He wants to go down in history as a person who started no wars and successfully put out fires around the world. So I think we should look at it in that perspective.
It's really interesting the way you describe that, Ken, in part because it's like he will have to put his money where his mouth is when he says, you know, the war in Ukraine would not have happened under me. So maybe there are some similarities there. But I do also wonder when you talk about the common interests in Europe, when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, and as a result of that, certainly there is going to be now this conversation of whether Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet. You can imagine that increasing, right? The idea we need to do more for our own defense because we don't know how reliable the U.S. is going to be. Do you imagine that conversation happening in Japan and among allies in Asia as well when it comes to the questions of Taiwan and standing up to China? Do you imagine that will pick up? I know the current prime minister had talked about an Asian NATO, but perhaps that's not something that would happen under Trump, or I don't know. But do you imagine there will be more of this sense of we have to stand on our own 2 feet? Or is there a realistic expectation that Trump will be involved, the U.S. will stay as engaged as it was before?
Yeah, so one of the pillars of Joe Biden's foreign policy was defending the international rules-based order. And Japan very much subscribed to that. But I think it's clear that Trump will not be pursuing the rules-based international order as the shining beacon on the hill. He will be much more America first in his pursuits. And then if Europe or Japan wants to continue to pursue the rules-based international order, even while the American president is not interested, of course that means more burden sharing and more defense budget and taking on more of a role. And if Europe or Japan doesn't feel that it's worth like doubling your taxes to do that, then they won't do it, and then they would have to set different priorities. I think the game has changed, and it's wrong to assume that America will continue Biden's path, and everybody would have to adjust and make their own choices.
Ken Moriyasu, diplomatic correspondent for Nikkei Asia. Thank you so much for joining us on the Monocle Daily.
Thank you for having me.
You're back with the Monocle Daily, live from Washington, D.C. Now, one of the big questions up next is what exactly kind of leader Donald Trump will be, whether he will be a Democrat or an autocrat, whether he'll be isolationist or engaged, whether he'll cozy up to our foes or abandon our allies, or will he actually be tougher on our enemies than people might expect?
All of these questions now go from the theoretical of a heated campaign to the reality of the next 4 years. Well, for more on this, I am delighted to say that we're joined by Uriel Epstein, Executive Director of the Renew Democracy Initiative, and by Holly Dagres, non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council and editor of the Iranist newsletter. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Uriel, let's start with you, if I may, because your organization specifically works with dissidents from around the world to raise up democracy. You hosted a conference just before this election with dissidents that I attended last week. What did you make of Tuesday's results?
Well, I don't think we were necessarily surprised, but, I think, or rather, I don't think we were shocked, but I do think we were surprised by the scale and scope of what we saw. And one of the key things that I think we are recognizing is that on the one hand, I do not think that a majority of voters, when they were voting, were really thinking about issues related to democracy, authoritarianism and things like that. They were voting for a whole host of other issues, whether it's a repudiation of Democrats having gone too far to the left, or it was simply like, this trend that we've seen around the world of incumbent parties losing. I think that's been almost universal, that in developed democracies, incumbent parties have been losing the last couple of years. But that having been said, given Donald Trump's rhetoric and given the rhetoric of those who are associated with him and who are closely advising him, people like Tucker Carlson and so forth, I think there are valid concerns of authoritarianism. And this is something I was talking about just yesterday with our chairman, Garry Kasparov, who's a prominent Russian dissident and former world chess champion, which is that unfortunately, we believe that Americans are really going to need the experience of dissidents, of people who have experienced backsliding in their home countries, who've experienced democratic institutions failing, and who can perhaps offer their wisdom about what issues, what challenges, what threats are real and must be confronted, and which ones maybe aren't necessarily as threatening.
Holly, what about you? What has been your reaction to Trump's victory? Because I'm curious to hear, what do you think this will mean for the Middle East in particular, a region that will still be on fire as he enters office?
Well, I think surprise is one way to describe it, but I would say I'm also not surprised. I'm surprised that he won, but not surprised about why people voted for him, to put it concisely. In terms of the Middle East, he's coming in as president in a very divisive time in the region, with the Gaza war having surpassed its one-year anniversary. And the Middle East is a very different place than it was during his tenure as president. He prided himself on Israeli-Arab relations through the Abraham Accords, and there was, of course, being someone that works on Iran, most notably the maximum pressure strategy, which was this 12-point policy plan that would, in essence, make Iran, quote-unquote, a normal country again. And then part of that was, of course, the withdrawal from the JCPOA, or Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, a multilateral nuclear deal that, till this day, we have nothing in place of it. And so he's coming to office at a time where it's a very different Middle East. And I think at the end of the day, this is someone that fears war, does not like it. From what we've heard, some reports that he's told Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that he wants this war done by the time he is in office. Whether that will be taken seriously or not is another question. But it's going to be a very different portfolio than it was back then.
Just to follow up on that, because that is the really interesting question, isn't it, Holly? I mean, is there anything he can do to achieve something like that? It is interesting that so quickly we're getting these sources that are saying, he's going to end the war, wants to end the war before he enters even office.
Well, before I heard that comment, my theory was this, that when Netanyahu had visited him in Florida, that he had actually made a deal to say, like, hey, when I come to office, let's make this war end on my turn, during my tenure as president, so that I can be the pacemaker. I'm the ultimate deal maker, and maybe I'd get a Nobel Peace Prize in the process. Like, that's the kind of thinking that Trump has. And so up until that point, that was my thinking. Now, what that looks like now is very different. But you also have to remember that Netanyahu has also upset at Trump. He congratulated Joe Biden on his win in 2020, and Trump does not forget that kind of thing. And so I think there's going to be tensions.
I love how that's all it takes, just congratulating the previous victor.
And just to add to that, I think we forget part of the reason Trump ran for office in the first place was because then President Barack Obama made fun of him at the White House Correspondents' Dinner.
100%, yeah.
And
I bet Obama wants to take that back.
But yeah, and it's that kind of thinking that drives Trump. And so I'd be curious to see what that Netanyahu-Trump relationship looks like in the second term of Trump.
Well, and looking towards Russia, Uriel, what do you think Trump will be making, that Russia will be making of this result? Will they be happy?
Absolutely. I think there's absolutely no question of that. I mean, you have one of Trump's biggest allies having shot a show in Moscow Moscow and having been apparently amazed at the at Russian supermarkets. I'm thinking, of course, of the Tucker Carlson interview. So it's kind of mind-boggling. But what I think it's important to highlight here is the global and interconnected nature of these authoritarian efforts. I mean, that's something that I think we just haven't done a good job of communicating to the public. And you'd mentioned the conference that my organization, RDI, just hosted. That the goal of that conference was to bring together dissidents from oppressive countries all over the world here in the U.S., alongside American policymakers, staffers, elites, other influencers, and so forth, and talk about how we combat authoritarian influence here in the U.S. And so the thing that concerns me, and my number one priority over the course of the coming years, is going to be keeping track of that, right? It's going to be looking at what Vladimir Putin does here in the U.S. It's going to be looking at what other dictators do here in the U.S. And, earlier we just talked a little bit about the relationship with Iran and Trump's maximum pressure campaign. But what's fascinating to me is that is, on the one hand, a tactic that I actually happen to agree with. I think that's a good tactic. I think it's an appropriate tactic. And, we work with Iranian dissidents, people like Masih Alinejad, whom I'm sure you're familiar with. And we're all on the same page here. But then we see some of the rhetoric as it relates to Russia's dictator and as it relates to other dictators. And there's a disconnect there where these dictators are all working together, and yet we appear to be trying to fight them one by one, where we have, this one approach of maximum pressure towards Iran, but then there appears to be this, incredibly conciliatory note towards Vladimir Putin, who's, of course, one of Iran's biggest allies and backers. And I think there needs to be a lot more of a globally strategic approach to these dictators. So in short, in answer to your question, yes, I think people in Moscow right now are fairly satisfied.
Just to follow up.
I was just going to interject and just add, it's ironic because I think if Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, was to flip the switch and be like, yes, we'll sit with you, Trump, and do a photo op and a 2-pager, he'll be writing love letters to Khamenei too. and I think that's really all it takes. And that I always say that he wants a deal a la North Korea. And I really think that copy paste could be applicable to Iran. We just heard from former special envoy to Iran, Brian Hook, who's leading the transition team, where he said that they're not interested in regime change, which is not surprising to me at all, but also that they want to make sure that Iran's behaviors change and that there's some sort of deal made to make sure the nuclear program is put in check. So to me, that signals that there is a possibility that a deal would happen. And if it's done the right way, Tehran might come out the victor in this.
Well, that's what's so interesting about this, isn't it? Because it is so unpredictable, and it can you can see it going a little bit both ways. Uriel, to jump on your point, we were talking about how, though, on the one hand, yes, he could maybe suddenly make peace with someone like Khamenei. On the other hand, he insults quite easily. And so when it comes to even something like Russia, he has made this claim, the war wouldn't have happened under me. If he was in power at that point and Putin had gone ahead with it anyway, how might he have reacted to that? So I do wonder, in that sense, do you think, could this also go another way? If Putin doesn't do Donald Trump's bidding, somehow pulls him into a war, doesn't accept the peace that Trump sets out on day one, as he claims he's going to do with Ukraine, this could go a very different direction.
It could, although I would be doubtful. I mean, Putin is nothing if not a master manipulator, right? I mean, he's a former KGB colonel, although, of course, one of his most famous quotes is that there's no such thing as a former KGB colonel. And, if there's one thing that the KGB was incredibly good at, it was manipulating people. And unfortunately, I think Trump has proven himself to be fairly easy to manipulate by catering to his whims, by catering to his idiosyncrasies, his ego, and so forth. And so I think Putin would not be so selfish, would not be so, not selfish, but rather would not be so foolish as to simply point blank, insult Trump or say no or whatever. Instead, he would, I think he would be incredibly nice to Trump. He would praise him, talk about how brilliant he is, and so forth, and ultimately bring Trump around to the type of outcome that I think would be most favorable to the Kremlin. Now, is it possible that it could go the other way? Of course it is. But that's my final point, which is that some people point to Trump's unpredictability as a positive, that it's a good thing because then dictators will be afraid to act or whatever. But I actually point to it. I mean, that unpredictability unpredictability may have some positive elements to it, but it has an incredibly big downside, which is that our allies won't know whether or not they can trust us, and our enemies won't know whether or not they should fear us. And ultimately, with respect to American foreign policy, that should be the top objective, that our allies come to trust us and that our enemies fear us.
And on the flip side of that relationship with Putin, what about Zelensky here? Zelensky was quite quick to congratulate Donald Trump on his victory, perhaps going back to the point we were making that that's all it takes, to ensure that everything is appeased and we're all on the same side.
Get on his good side.
Exactly. But considering what he has said over the past 4 years about Zelensky in regards to this war, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how you think this future relationship might look like.
I think it's going to be an incredibly fraught relationship. I mean, look, Zelensky did exactly the right thing by having immediately congratulated Trump. And in fact, I was on Ukrainian television just yesterday, and and I was saying basically all the same stuff that I'm saying here, except in Russian. And it was interesting because I was speaking with a few members of the Ukrainian Rada, which is their parliament, and they pushed back on me on some of these concerns. And I didn't, and I understood where they were coming from, right? Like from their point of view as the government, as representatives of Ukraine, they have to portray this incredibly optimistic, friendly tone towards Trump because that's what he responds to. And that's what we're going to start seeing around the world is people are going to start paying lip service to his brilliance and, his resolution and all of this. And I wonder, what that will ultimately translate to, because what we saw when he was last in office was that he actually ended up putting a lot more pressure on our allies in certain instances than he did on our enemies. And, the last thing I'll kind of last reminder I would offer here is that with respect to North Korea, at first we were worried about nuclear war with North Korea, right? Because Trump was talking about how his nuclear button is bigger than Kim Jong-un's nuclear button. Wink, wink.
Fire and fury.
And then, of course, he's writing love letters to his best pal.
Yeah.
I did kind of want to ask you both a similar question because we have been talking about the role of dissidents. I wonder what dissidents will be thinking of this moment in Iran, around the world, how they will sort of see the American ideal at this point in the conversation, and also, frankly, whether there is some worry, and Uriel, maybe you could answer this part of it particularly. I've spoken to some people here in the U.S. who are critical of Donald Trump that now fear, do they have to leave the country? Do they fear the retribution of Donald Trump? Is that a reality? What does this mean for people who are critical of democracy?
Well, I think with Iranian dissidents, it's different than a Saudi or Emirati dissident. A lot of Iranian dissidents, I can't speak for all of them, feel that Trump is the only U.S. president that can really pressure the regime and enough to maybe even topple it. Not necessarily, I know we've been hearing rhetoric that they're not in the business of regime change, but I think that at least some of the people that were closest to Trump, like former National Security Advisor John Bolton, CIA Director Gina Haspel, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State and CIA Director previous to that, were interested in regime change. They weren't necessarily saying it out loud, but we know of their views on the Islamic Republic, and that was kind of the direction they were going as part of the max pressure strategy. And so, as we saw with the 2022-2023 Women Life Freedom Uprising, Iranians don't want the Islamic Republic. They literally were risking their lives facing bullets and batons. Teenage children were risking their lives for change in that country, and that was unsuccessful at the time. And so I think that this new Trump administration is going to evoke this sense that maybe that this possibility is still an option.
So I'll broaden this out because I absolutely agree with your assessment of Iranian dissidents. And as you pointed out, dissident communities are different, right? I mean, there's no such thing as a single monolithic dissident community. And again, I just want to define what a dissident is first and foremost. A dissident is someone who has taken massive risks, whether personal or professional, in order to oppose their home country's government, right? In order to oppose the regime. Many of these dissidents have risked their lives, and now many of them are living in exile here in the U.S. And I do think many of them feel threatened. dissident. But there are dissident communities which have different points of view. And I think I generally agree with you that the Iranian dissident community has a point of view that Trump will actually bring much more pressure to bear on Iran. The same goes for elements of the Venezuelan dissident community and of the Cuban dissident community, each of whom believe that Republicans historically are more interested in standing tall against dictators. Now, here's the interesting and unique thing, is that Donald Trump's rhetoric in a lot of cases is fairly similar to the rhetoric that we hear from some of these dictators in some of these countries.
That's the contradiction in a way, yeah.
It's a fundamental contradiction. And one of the things that I kind of want to highlight here is this is where RDI thinks that dissidents can actually play a really useful and unique role. Because, we pulled together a program called the Front Lines of Freedom, which is this network of dissidents from 40 different countries, over 100 dissidents. And the thought is that we can simultaneously do two things. We can, one, highlight exactly the challenges that we've pointed out around Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba, et cetera, in certain instances, places where Donald Trump has actually said and done the right things. But also to highlight for Americans the way in which some of the rhetoric and some of the things he has threatened to do and some of the things he has done actually align fairly closely with some of these dictators back home.
Uriel Epstein of the Renew Democracy Initiative and Holly Dagres of the Atlantic Council. Really interesting conversation. Appreciate you both joining us here on the Monocle Daily.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
This is the Monocle Daily live from Washington, D.C. Whatever you may think of Donald Trump, it's clear that has upended the traditional style of campaign and communication. Unapologetic and off-script, no doubt causing fits for his staff that had tried desperately to keep him on message in the final days of the campaign. And yet, maybe the lesson of this is that Donald Trump had it right all along.
Because he is certainly a communicator, isn't he? And to talk about the role of communication, who better to join us than Dana Perino, former White House press secretary, host of Perino on Politics, and co-host of the cable news' most watched show, The Five on Fox. Dana, great to have you on the program.
Thank you. I'm sure you could find better people, but I am honored to be on your show again.
Well, we really appreciate you joining us. Absolutely. Nobody better for this kind of segment. But tell us, first of all, obviously you were on, you were doing election night just like we were here in our little studio in Washington, D.C. What was election night like for you?
I was just telling a friend that it was such a great experience to be with the team at Fox News because the main sort of group of us have been doing this together for 3 cycles now. So we did 2016, 2020, and 2024. So one, we're good friends. We have camaraderie and we have a common history. So I think that our energy and ability to play off of each other and to have that great respect of like, that's a good point, or you know what, I better pay attention to when Brit Hume is talking because I want to hear what he has to say about that. So to see if I could come up with something. And I thought that was great. The whole package was good. I think the best news for our country is that this was a decisive result. There are no questions about election integrity. And after going through the last 4 years of what we've all been through, I think that is a really important thing for all of us to have. It doesn't mean there weren't some problems and some states couldn't do a better job, but overall, the integrity of the vote is secured.
Well, and on that point, Dana, Biden earlier today spoke quite passionately about this idea of the transfer of power. And of course, Trump had not necessarily said that he would accept the result. But were you surprised after all those threats of violence and all the myriad of confusion about election interference? Were you at all surprised that it went as smoothly as it did?
In a way, except that I am reminded that, first of all, a lot of that was bluster from both sides and preparing for what could be a very close election. And, right up until the votes were counted, it was tied. I remember waking up on election morning and getting the results from Ditchville, Knox, New Hampshire. That's the first town in America that votes every cycle. There's a very small population, 6 people. And the result was 3 for Trump and 3 for Harris. And I thought, of course it was, because this election has been so close all along. And I would say this, though, many states, I would say, except for Pennsylvania, really tightened up their counting. Well, let me say Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Nevada. I think those 3 states could probably use their state legislatures' time well in the next 4 years to try to improve upon their processes. For example, in Nevada, they have a lot of early voting and a lot of mail voting, but they don't do any of the election sort of tabulation until all the polls are closed. No, not even the polls are closed. So everybody that's in line has finished voting. I think that could be tightened up. We are in the modern technological age. There's no reason that they couldn't count votes like Florida does or Georgia does. There are some really good best practices out there, and there's some state legislatures that should take a look at that. But I think also, even though it's frustrating for somebody from the outside looking in, in fact, I talked to a woman today. She's a green card holder from Ukraine, and she was very confused as to why all these different states count differently. And as I tried to explain it to her, I understand that it's a little bit confusing. However, it does make sure that there's not widespread corruption, right? Because if you were going to have some big corruption scheme, you'd have to do it in all 50 states. And that's very hard to do, which is why I think this time around, with it being more decisive, we have the integrity of the vote intact. And that means a lot in terms of just, okay, let's move on then. What's the transition? And then the Democratic Party can think about what happens to them going forward, because they lost so decisively.
Dana, I was at one of Donald Trump's last rallies, the one in Lititz, Pennsylvania, on Sunday. And I did want to ask you, as a former press secretary as well, what do you make? What did you make of Donald Trump's style of communication in those final days? Would you have been kind of pulling your hair out in those final days when he goes off script? Or is that something that we actually have learned through this, that you actually have to either encourage, or at least it just works for him, whatever else we say?
Yeah, I think that you have to respect that he has his finger on the pulse of what his voters want. He is his own person. He has a lot of energy. He is unapologetic. He is brash. He is just somebody who will go 100% in your face. And that is not my style at all. And it's not the style of the guy that I work for, George W. Bush. But things change. And the electorate was changed by Obama. He was a very different type of campaigner. I don't think he ever made somebody like me want to faint with things that he was saying. But I remember in Obama's reelect, there was a whole piece about how Obama wasn't having fun on the trail, and that one of the pieces of advice from the campaign advisors was, you have to let Obama be Obama. Stop trying to script him so much. Let him be himself. And perhaps also because there's so many different ways for people to look at the candidates now, and voters want authenticity in everything that they're consuming and everything that they're buying. They want authenticity, and that includes their candidates. And I do think Kamala Harris had a real problem with that, because she campaigned so cautiously and very tentatively that it made voters think she was just not being straight with them.
And Dana, just, looking back, you were, of course, press secretary in the Bush administration during quite a similar wartime. And Trump is coming into office when there's a myriad of conflicts around the world. I'm curious from your take, what advice would you have for whoever ends up being his new press secretary?
Well, one of the things is that there is no substitute for knowing the policy and knowing your president and knowing the commander-in-chief. And I'm sure that President Trump will be this way as he was before, which is he allows the press secretary to be in the room when decisions are being discussed and made, so that even if it's classified, because you would have a classified clearance, that doesn't mean you're going to go to the White House podium and tell everybody what just happened. But it does mean that, one, the reporters know that you are in the know, and that matters. It also matters for them to understand that in any given time, there are many different audiences watching the United States, the commander-in-chief, and the White House at any time. And that would be, of course, the general public in America, our military, our allies, our adversaries, and I can't remember the fifth one off the top of my head. I feel like Rick Perry in that debate in 2016. But there's multiple audiences watching all at once. And you have to make sure that you are communicating very, very clearly about what the president's intentions are. However, I would say this. I don't know if the press secretary has a lot to do, because President Trump likes to talk to the media. He communicates well through them, and he utilizes social media to do that. So I think that you're going to have direct communication from the president of the United States, which in some ways makes the press secretary's job harder, but in other ways makes it much easier. So you're going to have to decide. But I think it'll be a good job for whoever gets it.
I think we all remember Anthony Scaramucci and how that went. Dana Perino from Fox News, former press secretary to George W. Bush. Thank you so much for joining us on the Monocle Daily.
Now, we are approaching the end of our very final show from our special US election series, coming to you from Washington, D.C. And we thought we'd look back at what has been a week that has felt like a month. I think we can speak for everyone. And we're joined here in the studio by Monocle's correspondent, Thomas Lewis, freshly arrived from Philadelphia, and also by Simon Marks, Washington-based reporter, the founder of Feature Story News, where we have been based throughout this week. Great having you both here with us.
Love having us. And lovely having you here.
Well, first of all, thank you, Simon, for being such a gracious host.
Of course.
We, of course, throughout election night, we were all here, and there were multiple naps on the couches and a lot of
We
coffee.
spotted you napping Simon at one point.
I eventually bagged it. I had to push people off it, but I eventually got it.
How about you, Tom? Did you get to nap at all throughout the evening?
I didn't nap at all, not to show off here. I did stay up and power through till about 4 a.m. And when I got back to my hotel...
4 a.m. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to make a comparison here, Simon. I don't
It's another close race here after a year of close races.
Well, in our case, I think we powered through all the way through the day. And the one time I went on the roof for fresh air, I think I completely fell asleep until our colleague Sam Impey woke me up. It's like, you need to get back into the studio.
I do have to say on that point for myself, right at the end, I will shamelessly admit this. After everything, after most of our shows, I was going to do one final interview, and I was waiting for the person to arrive, and we were doing it over the internet, and I literally fell asleep while waiting for the person to arrive. Luckily, she was also delayed and actually hadn't found the time to do the interview. But it just goes to show a little bit how this night has gone.
Maybe it's having a nap also.
Exactly. It's been an eventful week. And Tom, I would wanted to bring you in because, of course, you've been in a different state, hearing from lots of people. What was that moment when, the mood shifted? How was that like?
Well, it's sort of the sort of sadness of it all and the creeping kind of solemnity of that room that was so full. Free pizzas being handed out, cheap drinks at the bar, people in festive moods with their Kamala Harris t-shirts. And this was a party hosted by the Democratic Party of Philadelphia, who were saying thanks basically to all those thousands of people who'd been knocking doors, making phone calls, sending out yard signs to people. And those people were really thrilled to be there. And by about 11 o'clock, that room was, less than half full, and the mood was just very sad. Lots of shots of whiskey being lined up at the bar for people to sort of, to try and soothe the nerves, I suppose. But by the time they finally threw us out, I guess it must have been about 2:30 in the morning. Yeah, it was a pretty solemn mood. And it reminded me, I think, when we spoke, Carlota, that morning, being in a similar party in New York back in 2016 for Hillary Clinton supporters. And the mood then, there were a lot of tears in that bar, people sort of essentially running out of the bar. Just in disbelief. There weren't as many tears this time around in Philadelphia, but the sense of a heavy realization of how things had gone was really kind of palpable.
I had a very similar experience right here in DC. I went to the DC Democratic Party, just around the corner from here, actually, a 10-minute walk. And it was about 10:30 p.m. when the mood started shifting. And it's like, well, I better head back to the studio.
Simon, what was the night like for you? I mean, you were kind of wearing so many different multiple hats. So you were watching the results, you were covering the results, you were also managing all the myriad of reporters from lots of different countries who are actually here in this studio, in this whole place with us. What was it like for you? What went through your mind?
Well, election night is always crazy, regardless of the narrative of the story. But the narrative of this political story, and I agree entirely, I mean, it did have that 2016 patina to it, at the beginning of the night. Even to the point where the exit poll at the beginning of the night had data that you read, 35% of the public say that their number one issue is democracy, and you thought, oh, that's going to be very good for Kamala Harris, in exactly the same way as some of the 2016 exit poll data you read, and you thought, oh, Hillary Clinton's definitely going to walk it. And then over the course of the night, that awful New York Times needle that we all watched in 2016 move from Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump started moving further and further away from Kamala Harris and towards Donald Trump. And I think the realization set in, certainly here among all of the reporters that we had working in the building here and in the various battleground states as well, that we were about to witness something seismic, and in a way more seismic than 2016, because he won the popular vote. I mean, that's the really extraordinary aspect of this story.
That's what made this such a drubbing.
Incredible. I mean, if you look at the numbers, in 2020, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won 81 million votes. On Tuesday night, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz won 66 million votes. Where have the other 15 million people gone? I mean, that's not a small percentage of the American population. And they absolutely repudiated not just her, but sufficient down-ballot Democrats that we now know that the Senate's going to be in Republican hands. Looks like the House of Representatives, they'll extend their majority. And the stage is set for Donald Trump to come in and be the most powerful president, able to get whatever he wants done legislatively on Capitol Hill, with, of course, the backing of a 6-3 majority in the US Supreme Court. It's astonishing.
And I think what caught me in my tracks, I was in Wisconsin last week, in Milwaukee, and in Philadelphia too over the past few days, especially on Election Day in Philadelphia, when you'd ask people, how are you feeling, at a coffee shop or whatever, and quite a few people saying, well, I'm not going to vote. There's no point. It won't make a difference. And then you had the images in Philadelphia of these lines around the block, people queuing up 4 hours, first-time voters, really excited to go. And like you say, when we saw this real dip for Kamala Harris and then the surge even in places like the cities for Donald Trump, this bigger share of the vote for him, I think that's why this solemn mood on that night sort of came to sort of bed in, because people couldn't really match those two feelings or those two things that they seemed together. They seemed so different to each other.
And I'll give you one sense of the despondency in this town. When I finally got out of here yesterday, I took the bus home. And on the L2 bus last night, which sails up Connecticut Avenue, I was flanked by two passengers, both of them on their telephones, both young women who were speaking to loved ones. One appeared to work for a non-governmental organisation, another had worked on the Harris campaign in some fashion. And they were both having very similar conversations. The one from the NGO telling a loved one that she and her husband had decided not to buy a property here, not to start a family here, and were thinking of moving out of the country because they thought that Washington and the United States was now going to become so alien to them and to her from a working perspective. And the other saying that she was now beginning to get the process started of freshening up her curriculum vitae to send it to potential employers in quote-unquote friendly states. In other words, those parts of the United States where the Democrats are still in charge, because she recognised she was completely done here.
And just to add to that, I stood in line for about 4 hours on Monday night, the eve before the election, for the big Rocky Steps rally that Kamala Harris gave, her final rally, and I made friends with two 20-year-olds. They'd driven an hour and a half from New Jersey, first time voting. They were so excited. And we kept in touch at the morning after the election day. They were a boyfriend and girlfriend, and the girlfriend texted me, I live in Toronto usually, can we come back to Canada with you? They felt so despondent, and they just couldn't believe that their first voting experience had gone not their way.
The flip side to my fellow bus passengers is, can you imagine the frenzy and excitement in Trump world and all of those thousands of people who are now planning to move here.
Well, just as a final note on that, I was at Donald Trump's rally in Lititz, Pennsylvania on Sunday, and the excitement, the people there, you really saw what a movement this was. People had been at multiple rallies bringing their children to see Donald Trump. I mean, just the energy of that, those are the people that now are ecstatic that their side has won.
Mm-hmm. Simon Marks and Thomas Lewis, thank you very much for joining us.
We appreciate both of you being here, and Simon Marks particularly for letting us be in this studio for the last few days. That is all the time we have for this edition of the Monocle Daily, live from Washington, D.C. A big thanks to all of our guests. Today's show was produced by Carlota Rebelo. Our sound engineers were Sam Impey here in D.C. and Sarah Nickel back in London.
The Monocle Daily is back at the same time tomorrow, this time back in London with Andrew Muller and the team. And you can follow all of our coverage by subscribing to the podcast. I'm Carlota Rebelo.
And I'm Chris Cermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.